Even as all eyes are focused on the case of George Floyd and police misconduct in Minneapolis, there's another troubling issue that's getting some well deserved attention all the way to the White House: a spike in violent attacks against Asian Americans across the country.
An uptick in recent weeks in violent attacks against Asian Americans. This surveillance video capturing an alleged assailant in California violently shoving an 84-year-old Thai American man to the ground. He died of his injuries days later.
This surveillance footage shows a 71-year-old Asian grandmother violently shoved to the ground, her purse stolen.
52-year-old woman being pushed to the ground on Roosevelt Avenue in Flushing, Queens Tuesday.
A 91-year-old man pushed in Oakland's Chinatown.
The 36-year-old victim, who is Asian American, walking when his attacker runs up behind and stabs him.
Vicious hate crimes against Asian Americans who've been attacked, harassed, blamed, and scapegoated. At this very moment, so many of them are fellow Americans. They're on the front lines of this pandemic trying to save lives. And still, they're forced to live in fear for their lives just walking down streets in America. It's wrong, it's un-American, and it must stop.
We're joined now by John Yang of the group Asian Americans Advancing Justice. And Mr. Yang, thank you for being here tonight. Were you heartened to see President Biden address this issue?
Absolutely. Oftentimes, Asian Americans struggle for visibility. We are thinking ourselves, does anyone see us? Especially during this time when we've seen these heightened attacks against our community. To have the president speak out so forcefully and denounce these attacks against our community gives us hope. There's still a long road ahead, but at least we know that someone sees us during this time.
And what do you think is at the heart of this, Mr. Yang?
Unfortunately, there's a lot of things going on. And to be clear, we've seen this since back in January of 2020, when COVID-19 first hit our shores in the United States. Because of misinformation, disinformation, people have this association that somehow Asian Americans are diseased or special carriers of COVID-19. And unfortunately, we've seen that before in history, where we've had the so-called yellow peril back in the late 1800s, or other issues where Asian Americans are seen as the perpetual foreigner. So certainly, number one, that is a driver as to why there's this fear, why there are these attacks. But the other thing we need to remember is that we are seeing a lot of economic insecurity. We are seeing a lot of fear. And whenever people have fear, they look for someone to blame. And unfortunately, in this case, the Asian American community has become a target.
A question for you, Mr. Yang, from Rhonda Schwartz. Rhonda?
John, do you have any advice if you are attacked, or if perhaps you see an attack like this going on? What should people do?
Sure. And there's a lot of good things that people can do, and I appreciate that question. First is it's important to report it. Is certainly, again, it goes to this notion of visibility that we've talked to. So our organization has a website called standagainsthatred.org where people can report hate incidents so that we can document it, we can tell stories around it. The second thing I would encourage people to consider is get what is called bystander intervention training. So that allows a person, if they see an act of hate, and it doesn't have to be directed at the Asian American community, but if they see an act of hate or racism, they can do something about it. Now, to be clear, I'm not asking people to be superheroes and jump in and stop something. But there's oftentimes little things that you can do that makes that victim just feel a little bit better and suffer a little bit less trauma in that moment.
Let me ask you this, the role of former President Trump. He continues to refer to COVID-19 as the Chinese virus. He hasn't been helpful, has he?
Unfortunately, he has absolutely not been helpful. And even just a few days ago, before President Biden spoke, he referred to it again as the China virus. And certainly we know that anytime language that is used like that, it has caused a spike in anti-Asian racism. So it is clear that that is one of the causes. The fact is that these words matter. They matter to making people think about COVID-19 in a certain way, to cause people to blame a certain community for COVID-19. And that, I think President Biden had it right. That has to stop. That's un-American.
And do you see it stopping since his speech last week?
Well, unfortunately, it's going to be a long journey. And number one is we hope that as people become more aware of this issue, people start to respond to it, react to it in a good way. But I think the other thing we have to recognize is that this isn't going to go away anytime soon. The reality is we do have geopolitical tensions with the Chinese government, and those are real and those are justifiable. But anytime you have these types of world tensions, there's a need or a desire to blame a particular community. And so even after COVID-19 passes or is under control, this is still an issue, this issue of racism that we all must work on together.
All right, John Yang of the group Asian Americans Advancing Justice, thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thank you very much.
Coming up next, this week's winners and losers in the media. See if you agree with the choices made by the editors of Mediaite. You're watching Brian Ross Investigates on the Law and Crime Trial Network.